Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Monero Meet for February 2022. Thank you for joining us. There is a lot going on in the Monero ecosystem. Those privacy transactions just keep working their way up. We had the CoinDesk Privacy Week, and of course, just Data Privacy Week across the board, where Monero is quite well represented. So I think we're doing pretty well. Today, you have myself, Justin. You have Arctic Mine. Hi, Arctic Mine.
And myself.
Hi.
Indeed.
Hello
Yep.
there.
Hello, Arctic Mine. Hello, Need Money 90.
Hello, I'm here too.
And we have Co. We also should have VT Nerd joining on in a second here, but if they get on, same with Seth. You know how it is. We're doing this one a little bit later today than normal, just because it just helps with my own schedule. I had a question that came in before we started, and I just wanted to read that here. It said, "I have a question for the Monero research team and development. Are you developing a more secure I2P Tor or Onion using Ring CT because they're worried that Tor has been compromised?" It's a little, quite a bit to unpack there, I would say. But I would say largely, Monero uses, it implemented Dandelion++ on its core transaction relay setup. So that way, even if you're not thinking about it, your transaction relays have better privacy than if, you're using some more stupid, less privacy conscious protocol. But Monero still does rely, if someone wants to, on I2P and Tor. I2P 0 is the common implementation for that, and Tor is just built in if you want to use with the GUI and stuff. So it's not that Monero doesn't use these things; it's just that Monero is not reliant on them. So it's I know there are quite a few different aspects to your question there. Although I would say largely though, Monero is not trying to make its own like mixnet thing at this time. Who knows if that'll change? But I guess good question for the room to start. Does anyone here have opening comments on mixnets and things?
Well, I think that that's a little out of scope for the Monero product in and of itself. We should be plugging into existing solutions in the space as opposed to trying to roll everything ourselves. I think there's something to be said about overextending our development efforts. If somebody decides to use CT in a way that can create a better anonymity protocol for exploring the internet, that would be fantastic. But I would say it's probably out of scope for the project at this point, unless it grows incredibly in scope.
To some extent, we tried to do that with Covery, right? And that was a lot of effort for a lot of pain, really. Arctic Mind, did you have a comment?
Yes, I do. One of the things to consider here, which is really important, which is actually came out in the issue with Covery, is that an anonymity network such as Tor or I2P can be easily DDoSed. And so there can be an advantage to send your transactions over Tor, but to synchronize with the Monero network and the ClearNet. And this is where there is an interface where it's important that we be aware of this point, because that was one of the issues that came up with Covery. And one of the problems with anonymity networks with no pricing, because as far as I understand it, Tor doesn't have pricing, is that without pricing, you can DDoS those things fairly easily. So that's kind of my thought on this. There is an interface element and there is a security element for Monero that we need to be aware of. That is one of the mitigations that was considered. Definitely at the time of Covery, that was very much considered.
I'm kind of with Need Money 90 on this one, though, because even though, and that's not to say I'm not on your side as well, right? But I'd say broadly in terms of this question, sure, there are people in the Monero ecosystem that are familiar with a lot of the basics when it comes to network propagation. They can look at Dandelion++ as it comes out and figure out how to implement it and if it's a good idea and do some tests and those sorts of things. That expertise is available and working in the Monero space. But when it comes to building everything from scratch in the way that you try to like replace Tor, that gets really, really complex. And even though you have some Tor enthusiasts that are also Monero enthusiasts and I2P enthusiasts that are Monero enthusiasts as well, it's a big ask to sort of rip all of that out. and to try to make our own thing, roll our own thing is to some extent. So
Custom solution.
yeah, yeah, it's there's a lot of people that need network privacy, and there's a lot of other people trying to do that. And sure, there's limitations, but I'm not yet convinced we can do it better.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. And I want to make this very clear. What I'm saying is if we accept that there's a compromised risk in Tor or in I2P, that we adapt to that risk by, if we're concerned about it, by syncing over the ClearNet if possible and sending the transaction over Tor. That's what I'm saying. So that in order to protect the security of the network, that's different from trying to replace the structure of Tor itself. So I just want to make that clear. I mean, it's definitely a distinction here.
Got it. Awesome. Any other comments on this before we move on? Again, Dandelion has been live for a bit. It's awesome. And you can optionally use Tor and I2P if you really want to as well, which is also awesome. So trust the one you want. Or use your own VPN or whatever you want to do. I do think as far as I2P 0 integration with the GUI, I think we haven't really taken that to the full extent that I would like to see that to be run. Also, hey, VT Nerd, welcome. Can you hear us just fine?
Yeah, I can hear you. What about?
Perfect. Yeah, we can hear you as well. We're just talking, we're just wrapping up a conversation about Monero's transaction privacy on the network level when it comes to Dandelion++, I2P, and Tor. One commenter doesn't trust Tor and I2P, so they were like, "Is Monero going to do their own?" And we're like, "Well, I don't know, probably not." But do you have any other thoughts on that, Lee?
Well, I mean that's a pretty big undertaking. I mean, there's also, I guess, GNU-NEP. I don't know that that's a little different. So I mean, Monero's plugin, the way it works is it could be extendable to any number of different networks as long as they speak SOX proxy. So I know there was one other project. I didn't think anything was going to come of it, but there was another project trying to create a new style Tor, and the idea was it would be geared to this type of messaging. They were at um, I met this group. I think actually Doug interviewed them when they were at um, what was the Fluffy Ponies? Ricardo's big conference they had with the other Bitcoin guys like Samson, the Magical Crypto Conference. So you can find them online talking about this because I'm pretty sure that Doug interviewed them. If you go through the back catalog, and so I don't remember the name of their project. They emailed me once, but the problem is they're basically starting from ground zero. So it's like imagine just restarting Tor. I mean, but as far as Dandelion++, I guess was a person's concern that they prefer to use Dandelion++ over Tor, or because the way it works is that if you use Tor, the remote side you can't control it, but if the remote side if you're running a standard daemon, it then uses Dandelion++ on the remote side. So
No, I think the question was very, very general. It was very, very generic. They asked, just to give you an idea, if we would build a network privacy layer using Ring CT, which doesn't make much sense, right? So
Right,
I think they just were very much asking a broad question.
I think the reason why there was always a separate project in Covey is because it's not something you want to bake into the daemon. I mean, that's like um you don't just put the entire kitchen sink in one mono project. So but we will. I have been trying to do encrypted P2P networks, but it's not going to be anything like Tor. It's just going to be so that the links are encrypted, but there's not going to be any type of obfuscating IP addresses and that kind of thing. It's just going to be direct hop. You send a Dandelion, but the difference is the link. So the ISP won't see the traffic. I guess the only difference would be in that scenario. But nothing at all like Tor or whatever this user was suggesting.
Yep, I think we're all kind of on the same page here. Any final comments on Monero's network privacy? I think by and large, Monero's covered the basics there at least, and there's always room to go, like you said, with the default encryption or optional encryption of some more of this packet data. But at the end of the day, like,
has this might be a question for Arctic Mind. Has any other project even gone as far as Monero has? I mean, as soon as we do P2P encryption, I think we may be like the furthest along, even more than because I guess Bitcoin does have Tor integration and all that some now, don't they? But I don't know that anyone has even done Dandelion plus Tor and all the other stuff.
I'm not sure about that. That Dandelion plus plus is on Bitcoin, if I understand correctly.
No, it's not at Bitcoin. They
Oh,
had
okay.
a Dandelion original version, and it never got merged, and no one ever did an updated version of it for whatever reason. And then a bunch of projects took the Dandelion non-merged patch and applied it and claimed it was Dandelion plus plus, but it wasn't. It was slightly different. Yeah. So I don't know.
So it's just like what happened with Ring CT way back when it was originally confidential transactions were originally designed for Bitcoin, and then it was not merged into Bitcoin, and then it ended up being modified for Monero. Yeah, I honestly I don't know the answer to that, but I'm suspecting that we may be the only one if that's the case. I thought Bitcoin had implemented it. Honestly, I was.
Well, the authors did. They did all the legwork, and they had a PR, and it just kind of went nowhere. And then I think it was because the Bitcoin authors then suggested a bunch of changes. They then wrote Dandelion plus plus, but I guess they just figured it wasn't going to get merged, so they just wrote the paper but didn't do an implementation.
Weird. Yeah, I don't think I go so far as to say we're the only ones that have Dandelion plus plus, but we're certainly the largest coin that does. Like,
I swear there's a Golang implementation on one project, but I can't remember now. But yeah, I guess what I'm saying is there's very few projects that have done the amount of work Monero is doing and is planning to do. So it's kind of like I don't even know what to compare it to, because they're like, oh, it's not enough. But like, what are you even comparing that to?
Monero's not good enough. Let me just use Bitcoin. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
I just want to give a quick reminder too that someone here might remember the name of the individual who posted a course, so to speak, on privacy coins, of which 80% was all about Monero and 20% was Bitcoin and Zcash combined. But they referenced all the main Breaking Monero episodes in that one, so it's kind of funny that among the 20 hours of content where they had 6 or more of it was Breaking Monero. It was just kind of funny. So if you haven't watched that yet, please watch Breaking Monero. You'll get sick of my voice, but you do need to watch it. And there are transcripts on the Monero Outreach website too, which I think they tried to include the diagrams in those too, but you'll definitely want to look at the diagrams. But anyway, sorry for not mentioning you earlier, but do you want to give an update on all the fun stuff that's going on in your side of the world on the Monero side of things?
Sure. Well, me personally, I've been working on my Seraphis library. I implemented Jamtis in its current iteration with some slight changes. And I'm working on getting it working so that I can actually make like transactions with it. In terms of the MRL, we have been discussing fees, I guess, with Arctic Mine. Not much else on that front. So with fees, I guess I brought up a concern that if transaction volume gets really, really big, then nodes will start to struggle, like low-end nodes will start to struggle. And so there may be like network instabilities when this kind of thing happens. So difficulties with users connecting to nodes because nodes are behind the network. So then users have to connect to like a limited subset of nodes, which implies some kind of centralizing force. Or yeah, it's basically kind of pressure towards centralization of the network when there's resource constraints for like the general population of nodes out there. So that's kind of the concern I brought up, and then Arctic Mine's been discussing it with us about like how we can deal with that.
One of the questions that I thought is that there may be an option to price transactions. So rather than a low frequency node, a node that's lagging, just simply connects with less people, it sends transactions that are higher paying. So it's prioritizes by transaction fee rather than by just trying to reach as many people and not do it well. So you sort of do a good job on a subset of the transactions rather than attempt to do a poor job on the whole thing. I think this is an area of interesting research. I mean, can we actually use pricing and finesse it to sort of mitigate that kind of thing? Because what I can see happening is if different nodes send different transactions, then you're going to increase the probability of open nodes, of open blocks, because different miners are going to be mining different transactions. So if you have a way to tell the network, okay, well, these are the ones that have priority over the ones that don't, and price is an effective way to do it. It sounds a bit strange, but like if you got a low frequency node, a node at low bandwidth, and say it can connect to 30 other nodes, it broadcasts a high paying transaction to the 30 nodes rather than just try to broadcast 30 transactions to one node. That's essentially the difference in that a pricing could do. So I think that's an area I think we can explore, because the instability I would expect would from what Koi raised this was going to would come up in the form of an increase in orphan blocks.
The orphan blocks, though, are a direct result of the inability to propagate the new block within the current the current block time. Can't you dramatically decrease the amount of orphans by increasing the block time?
Well, to a point, no, there's two different things. I mean, if you are just looking at latency of the network, theoretically, there's a point in which you actually get below which it doesn't help you no matter how much bandwidth you have. And this is actually what happened with Monero in its very, very early days. I mean, we had 1 minute blocks, and we had a fair number of orphan blocks. It wasn't because it was saturating the bandwidth. It was simply because you have relativistic effects, to put it in a simplistic way. I mean, a classic example, especially what's up in Prince George, is if Ricardo mines a block and then I mine a block. Well, how long does it take to transfer the data from South Africa to Western Canada? And over the fiber optic networks, this is a significant lag. And
but by increasing the block time, you're decreasing the probability that two people will mine a block simultaneously.
Well, what you're doing by increasing the block time is you're addressing that fundamental latency. And so, yeah, to a point, this is right. But I think the problem that's brought up here is a bit different. The problem is that you're replacing, because you don't have enough bandwidth in certain nodes, what you're doing is you are creating latency to make up for the lack of bandwidth. And so that's the issue there. And so then you get a situation where you have a different set of transactions being sent to different parts of the network, basically. This is what I'm saying. So you could actually you could mitigate those type of problems with pricing. I mean, that's one of the options. I mean, rather than simply try to do everything badly, just do the higher paying transactions well, as far as you can do as a node. And that is the fundamental problem, because you're propagating you're propagating transactions, but you also propagate. So again, I would say that you prioritize for the low frequency mode to propagate nodes that are actually mined over, say, low paying transactions. That's a perfect example of how you would address that. So I think you have to look at what is the priority to propagate and what should be left behind. If you have a restricted uplink bandwidth, regardless of how big you grow, you're still going to have that situation.
My concern with that as a solution is that users who want to pay low fee have low fee transactions would be incentivized to just submit those transactions directly to high bandwidth nodes, and then kind of hope that those high bandwidth nodes will propagate the transactions to other high bandwidth nodes. And you kind of expect that most of the hash power is going to have high bandwidth availability. So like especially the mining pools. So what happens is everyone on the margins kind of gets left out, even though even though like the network is still working, but what happens is everyone on the margins kind of drops off. And then as the costs increase, the margins kind of creep in on the center, and then you kind of get this centralization of who has all the ability to process transactions.
Well, I mean, there is a danger in the sense of what you're saying is if the miners can actually handle something that the most of the network cannot. Is what you're saying. But the other problem that you have is anyhow how you restrict. The higher paying players are going to be the ones that are actually going to get through. If you're going to go to the trouble to find a different node and all of that, you might just simply pay a higher fee. But I mean, there is an issue with that. But I'm not so sure that it makes sense for a low bandwidth node to do a lousy job of the whole thing rather than do a good job on a smaller subset. And that's essentially what I'm saying. So there may be, I'm not sure if, I think it's a threshold before you start getting people to directly submit transactions to miners. And it's not just a peak situation. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, and this is one thing that a lot of people don't realize when looking at a network, so not just us. I mean, for example, if you were to look at Visa, you could have like 15 or 16 time difference between the peak demand and the average demand. Like Visa historically, they will peak on December 23rd. And so you have this massive surge in certain points. And then at other points in time, it's a lot lower. So you do have this big fluctuation. So the more likely result is someone who pays a low transaction is just going to sit there and then it gets propagated. So yes, they don't get a delay. But I said, are they going to go to the trouble of directly putting it into a mining node? If they have that such an urgency, they might just decide, well, I'll just pay a slightly higher fee. And so you get a pricing market. The other problem, of course, and I guess that's the classic example of Bitcoin. I mean, if you totally restrict the thing, then it totally centralizes in other ways, such as centralized ledgers as a second tier, for example, which is very prominent in Bitcoin right now. So I mean, there are other problems that you trade off. But like I said, I'm just thinking that that's something that should be looked at from a research perspective. Whether we can actually optimize what transactions and what priorities if you have a scarcity or up like bandwidth.
Well, is this research that has already largely been done on Bitcoin?
Well, there is an article on the subject, but it's a reactive article, and this is the work by Peter Rizzo. Now, he argued quite legitimately in the presence of a block reward that often blocks, of course, miners to demand a higher fee because because of their cost. And one of the major criticisms of this is that it's a very reactive. Maybe you sort of wait to the network to be on the verge of failure and then you react to it. But that's the most significant case of research that I've seen in Bitcoin on this issue. I don't think anybody's really looked at the idea of saying, okay, if I've got a limited upward bandwidth, what should I be the priority from the benefit of the network that should be prioritized? So if I can only put up, like, say, 10 megabits of upload bandwidth, how should I deploy those 10 megabits in order to be as effective as possible and beneficial to the network? That's the question that I think needs to be looked at. If you have a limit, what's the best way to do it?
I think the best real world experiment is probably Ethereum at this point, where they're pushing disk IO and even CPU. So if you track their node usage, their node count over time, I believe it's been falling. And I know the interesting one to do this would be what's a bit see Jameson Lop did he does it every year. He tries to sync the blockchain to see how long it takes, and it's because he's a Bitcoin guy, so he's trying to show how fast it is. But you have to have a pretty decent system to sync with Ethereum. Specifically, your hard drive has to be fairly recent, and so does your IO bandwidth setup. So I guess I'm only pointing to that. That would be a very real world example. I think what Ko was trying to say, where there's a lot of focus on bandwidth, but the CPU time and the validation is another issue with the cryptography. And we can there's some of it that can be distributed to the cores, but like double spin checking, I think for the most part has to be on a single core, and then there's disk IO to do that the way Monero is set up. So it's just tricky. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be more cautious about extending the block size because of that. But
I mean, one of the interesting things about Ethereum is I haven't yet seen a significant change in the number of uncle blocks, which is their equivalent to orphan blocks, which is great. Now, one of the other things about Ethereum, and I think you raised a couple of really interesting points. The first one is that Ethereum has a really, really short block time, something like about 12 seconds or 15 seconds, which it goes to Niemann 90s point that if you really have a short block time, you really get into trouble. So that's a big one there. And then the other one with the other one with Ethereum is of course this business of um, the business is again are the nodes falling behind of the really centralized into high bandwidth nodes. I'm not sure that Ethereum is really that decentralized as many people think. I mean, it's just because of the short time, you need to be really well connected to keep up with that network. Now, the next point, which is really interesting, is this question of an older node aging in place. And by that, I mean the amount of power that you need to sync from scratch is way higher than what you need to actually just keep up with the network. And from a CPU verification time, however you're going to do that, that's also very significant. So if you're already in there, like if you have an old computer that's been syncing with Bitcoin for the last 5 years or 10 years or something, that's going to have a lot less trouble keeping up than if you take the same computer and say, I want to sync the blockchain from scratch. So there is an aging in place element to that too for the technology.
I think that's Ko made that point in the GitHub issue as well about
Yeah.
thinking from
Like the time it
scratch.
takes to catch up to that then point in time, and then of course you have to then catch the next.
Because in
step.
the worst case, you can't actually you can only keep pace. You can't catch up. You can only stay in, or you have to stay at the head. And if you're not at the head, you're behind forever, which is another really. Then you have to upgrade. So, but then you just lose nodes, really.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd like to quickly switch the topic. We've been talking about fees, and this will obviously continue in the Monero Research Lab channels. It's been a discussion that's been going on for many months already, but it seems like it's one of those things. Will discussion on node efficiency ever end? No, it won't ever end. It'll just keep going. So, Lee, I noticed that you and Justin Berman, were working on Monero LWS a lot more recently. Can you talk about the cool updates you've made on that side? And also a quick sentence on what LWS is?
Right. So we haven't. I don't think there's been many code updates other than he wants to do a few patches, and we've got to distribute work so we don't step on each other's toes. And actually, I guess I can shout him out. So Charlatan actually wanted to add some feature, I think, because he was asking about. There's a couple people using it, I guess. So Monero LWS is a implementation of the My Monero API. So in theory, it is compatible with the My Monero Android and iPhone app and desktop app. It'd be nice if there was a couple other implementations, at least for. I think I'm out doing a real basic one in curses and in a terminal only. Because we have it in Wallet 2, but it's been tough to maintain Wallet 2 doing. So I guess I should speak about what My Monero API does. So the difference between, say, what the standard wallet does, the standard wallet talks directly to the Monero node and downloads all transactions, and then from that point identifies when you receive funds. Um, and of course, when you want to send out, it makes that wallet communicates directly back to the Monero node. The LWS and My Monero stuff actually separates the two into a different process. So you have Monero node syncing to the network. The LWS is doing all of the cryptography to identify the transactions for n number of users. N meaning you could be 1 plus. And then that way on your cell phone, you basically have an instant on type behavior. And in fact, My Monero does a push notification. We don't have this implemented because they haven't, as far as I know, I strongly suspect that. I think I've seen some patches. I actually follow their repo, and I think I've seen some patches to that. They haven't open sourced that API, but what you can do is you can have your Monero node on your really beefy machine, and then you could have your super private ARM server communicating with the Monero node and syncing OnePlus cell phone users transactions, and then that again just distributes it to the cell phone or the desktop or whatever you have. So the advantage there is if you have a low power device, you don't have to constantly use CPU time to scan the blockchain. So I think I don't want to. I actually think Cakewallet is doing a good job, and there's benefits to it. But one of the downsides is that you have to turn it on, sync to the node, and then catch up and scan to it. You can't actually get any push notifications unless your cell phone is using CPU power all the time to constantly scan in the background. So, um, what's happening is that Justin Berman has taken interest in it. The Charlatan has been interested in it for some reason. That he works with a hardware company. I'm not sure if they're planning to use it, but it looks like there's going to be a few more possibly ZMQ features, maybe thanks to the Charlatan, and then uh, Justin had a series of updates he wants to do um, to really make it. So right now it's functional, but I think there's more like administration features that would be useful. Um, because at the moment, oh, and then he and there's really no official build system. There's no test runners and all that. So there's like it's functional, but it's not really ready to be merged, I guess, into the main line. And that was another discussion we had, but there's a decent amount of code there. Now, the other big push Justin did was he told me he was doing this. I didn't realize that he was ongoing this, but he audited the entire code independently. And I think his goal there was to say that there was at least a second person that reviewed it. There wasn't like a backdoor or something weird in there. And so he went through the entire code base and documented it and actually wrote a pretty decent write up recently about how it works.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw that on he opened a merge request or pull request with like a bunch of
yeah,
documentation.
it's
for it.
interesting. Someone telling you, I mean, he wasn't doing this, but it's interesting. Oh, he's telling me how my own code works. No, but uh, well, no, I guess to the benefit, it's like, well, he didn't ask me any questions, so I assumed that he understood how it worked. I guess it was pretty straight. I mean, it should be straightforward. Um, so there's another implementation for the people interested called Open Monero. The difference is LWS uses LMDB, and it was centered really heavily around ZMQ. So it hasn't been implemented, but you theoretically could have LWSs. I designed it so that you could almost have LWSs running on have a farm of scan machines if you wanted to. So you would have one machine would be your front end, and because of the way the MQ works, you could then push out scan requests um, to a farm system that were doing the scanning. No, I know that's pretty advanced, but like this is something you understand. Like I was writing the MyMonero backend, and I saw like the deluge of just CPU. It was
Yeah,
like, Lee, we're at
they
a
don't
99.
have one computer probably. They have quite a few that do all the scannings.
Right. And so part of it was kind of funky because I guess no one really minded, but I almost got to write not a better version, but like, well, lessons learned. How would you try to rewrite it? Um, and so I don't know. I think part of the issue that my Monero actually may take in some of the tech. I know they've taken in some of the stuff I wrote in open source. They merged it back into whatever they're doing. But yeah, so that's a big difference. Open Monero is centered around MySQL, so there's advantages to that because you can write a SQL query really quickly. But the MyMonero database uses LMDB, so it's a lot faster. But you have to end up writing C++ code, doing queries and changes. And I also did a pretty interesting debug feature, which dumps out everything in JSON and a bunch of stuff like that. But it's just a trade. I mean, there was no sense in writing another one in MySQL, and I wrote it that specifically to be an enterprise fast version. I think that's why the Charlatan was contacting me because it sounds like there's a few people that want to be competitors now. Now, I think most of us, like Justin Berman, they want, okay, you're running this for like 10 people in your family. I think that's more of their vision as opposed to I'm starting the next empire wallet business in Monero. But uh, yeah, so we'll have to go back and I can't remember all the features there. I think the big one was that we want to add in, at least I wanted to, but it's such a pain. The Monero has done it, but it's like funky, is the mempool scanning. So one of the changes I have made over the past 6 months is that LWS now gets ZMQ push notifications. So as soon as a block appears, it'll immediately trigger a scan and immediately update the database. But the trickier one is mempool scanning. And it's tricky because um, you can store it in the database, but it's so much in flux. It's like if something happens, it's like rolling back the blockchain kind of thing. and you're not really, but there's no block hash, and there's no block height, and so it's really funky when you're dealing with the database. Like, what do you even call it? Or do you just leave it in memory only? But then the problem is, if you flush the process and restart, the user then sees this transaction come and go. And that's one of the issues that my Monero had, was like, oh, we'll just do it in memory only. And then it was like, Ricardo would do Control C, and then he'd get all these emails just because of one Control C. So yeah, there's just stuff like that. Like we just gotta smooth out the edges, I guess. But it's functional now, and I guess people have been using it. So I guess that's helpful for me to know that we're not getting too many bad reports. So anyway, I highly recommend people do it, because I think in the end, I think it's actually a better setup than what Wallet 2 is doing now. With no disrespect to the team that built that, but by having that separation, you can get like the same exact feature set. It's just that you then have a flexibility of the scanning can be done on a different machine than either your wallet or your Monero daemon. It's sort of like the scenario we were describing earlier with having a separate process for the Tor network. You have the same advantage where you have flexibility, and that's what I was discussing about farming things out. I mean, you can have whatever flexibility you want, or have multiple ARM boxes or whatever. But I think Justin, that's why you were also interested, because you had this flexibility where you could have 1+ wallets. It was, in fact, if you're just running one wallet, there's really very little difference, other than you get to choose where the scan occurs and how it occurs. Like Open Monero was on demand. LWS is constantly in the background, so you can even choose between those two different variants if you want. In fact, that's an intentional design decision by both of us. So if you wanted something more similar to Wallet 2, you go with Open Monero. If you wanted something more enterprisey, you go with that. So anyway, if the users don't know about it, I highly recommend checking it out. We just have to get wallets for it, really.
Yeah, it's from my perspective, on my own personal level, I just want to have it running on a little stupid server in my own apartment. So that way, in theory, I have my own wallet. I hit connect. I like open it up, and it's like, wow, you are automatically synced with everything. And oh, look, I can get push notifications that say I get a transaction. Open the wallet. That's clearly nice. From Cake's hat on, though, I don't know if we want to do that with the view key because of the privacy side. Now, once Seraphis comes around.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll have to like co-talk about that. But I was just gonna tell you, like, if you're running the setup where you're running like you are, Justin, you're running it just for yourself. The privacy is identical.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. Like for me, and if I run my own server at my own house that scans my own wallet and nobody else's, like, that's fantastic. It's all of the efficiency with the downside that I have to run this extra server thing, right? Which is pretty lightweight, but I still have to set it up. So that's the downside. But if there was a way where you can, like, Seth would just make his new fancy guide that includes download the node and also LWS and like configure it with Cake Wallet or whatever, like, that'd be great. But Cake
like a USB
probably doesn't want to go the My Monero route of auto magically giving up your view key to, like, because that's really bad for privacy. So when Seraphis comes around, though, and we have all these different types of keys, if we just have the one that allows for us to have significantly less access to information but still have the huge upside, then that's where things start to get a little bit more interesting, where you no longer see the amount, you no longer see all sorts of stuff that you would have otherwise seen. So
right, and that's actually a big one. That leak is actually pretty big when they see the amounts, because it helps them.
It's bad. It's really bad, especially when you get to see the change output. You're like, you get to say, well, you don't see outgoing unless you get change, and then you're like, it's just.
I tell you, because I actually, I had to tell the My Monero team they should stop promoting it like that, because you know when you see the change, you know exactly what happened. And you know the real spin that way. But yeah,
technically there is some potential for ambiguity, technically, but good luck arguing that. In practice, there's no ambiguity.
Right.
So I am very interested in the fact that you built this to be able to scale in that way. I mean, we already have to run, like, we already run very beefy Monero nodes for users in order to do all the scanning for everyone that talks to us. And there's no efficiency there at all, because they are like, we don't have the view key for them. They're just asking us for all this information constantly, right? To scan on their own local side. So it's very inefficient.
No,
but
I should clarify. It's going to take a decent amount of work, but I mean, I set up internally. It uses ZMQ in-process communication. That way, you can just hit like change one string, and you're doing inter-process communication or even TCP communication. So you can even scale. Well, you probably wouldn't do interprocess on one machine, but it was designed with the idea that possibly you can extend that out. But the details of how you do that that would take a while. But because this is what happened. This is literally what happened in the back end. It was like it's just a complete. You're like, oh my god, this is nuts. We had so many. And the other thing is when the price would go up, that's when the server would just all get crammed at once, right? So that's another fun one.
One thing I want to mention with respect to Seraphis, I mean, this is one of the things of currently in the options that in Seraphis that is which is optimal for this type of wallet scanning. If I'm not misunderstanding, maybe Koi has some comments on this, but I mean that was one of the big arguments with the multiple keys is how can you do the scanning while minimizing the privacy exposure.
So the solution we settled on, Tevador and I, was so there are two view keys, if I remember right. So one key is called the find received key, and this key lets you kind of narrow down which outputs could be yours. So it discards most of them as being not yours, and then a small subset of them it says these might be yours. And it also does a little bit of cryptographic work so that if you get these candidates, once you get these candidates, you can cheaply look at them to figure out if you actually do own them. So the second key is the view balance key. And so this view balance key can look at all of the outputs identified by the find received key and figure out if you own them, look at the amount in the output, and and see if the output has been spent before. So it's like a fully featured view key, which we don't have right now, which is really nice. But the find receive key can barely figure out anything about the outputs you own. So at most, they can if you receive multiple outputs to the same address, then the find receive key will see that all of those outputs are received to the same address, and it can figure out which addresses have which outputs, but it won't see it won't see the amount in those outputs. And also, we have some neat tricks to hide change outputs and self-spend outputs from the find received key. So if you receive a change output, the find received wallet it'll flag the output as a possible as a candidate, but the address that it sees, the candidate address it sees, will be a fake address. So all your change outputs will look completely different to the find received key. And the advantage of this is you break this kind of heuristic that lets the scanner figure out which of your outputs have been spent.
And
Because
is
the
that
heuristic,
more complicated than just indexing to the next available address? Like, make this account as their change account. I know you're thinking it less of accounts now, but
no, you can send change to any address you want, and it'll all be hidden from the find received key. So
okay.
we use some like different cryptographic branches, I guess, logical.
That's pretty clever, though.
It should be similar to what the view tag is kind of doing, or I would assume, right? Where they, or at least, I mean, maybe not mathematically, but logically speaking, like you get, you can filter out a subset. You just don't know any information about that remaining subset, really. I think that's what he's suggesting. And so it's similar to just the first stage in the view tag. If for those that have looked that up,
like
I
that.
think it may be slightly different, but logically it's got to be closer to that what Phony's describing.
Well, it's so there's the candidate set that the find received finds, and
Right.
then in this candidate set, each one has a nominal spend key. So this the view balance key is going to try to match or recreate this nominal spend key, and then it'll know that it owns the output. But for change outputs, the nominal spend key that the find received wallet makes, it's a junk key. So it identifies the candidate, but it makes a junk key. And then down in the view balance wallet, it uses this heuristic. So in all the transactions where your key images appear, it looks in those transactions and sees if any of the outputs are candidates identified by the find received wallet. And so for all of those candidates, it uses a separate derivation path to get the nominal spend key. So it's a separate derivation path from the normal path that you use to create normal outputs. And so with this special derivation path, then you can check if you actually own the output. But since it's a separate path, the junk is always unique. It never looks the same. So the find receive key can't use it to learn anything about the change output. It's kind of complicated protocol in cryptography, but it's at the end of the day, the find received wallet can't connect change outputs together and heuristically identify the transactions where you are spending money, at least not nearly as easily as you can right now.
So if you had the find receive key, if we're just walking through how a push notification would work, let's say you're not using.
I don't think push notifications would work at all.
Yeah, because you would be like, you may have received this transaction, right?
Every 1 out of 256 outputs.
Okay, so you would get a lot of notifications.
Yeah. Right. This is why I was equating it to the view tag. You'd be sending the phone less stuff. But again, I think what would probably have to do is change the API so you can select which mode you want. But it may be a little confusing for people. I don't know. But the My Monero team may be pissed off about this. But
there are ways around. There's one thing you can do is you can tell the find receive key which of your addresses might receive funds, and then it can match the nominal spend key against these candidate addresses.
So
but this only works for normal outputs you receive. So you could get a notification for normal outputs you receive, but you wouldn't get a notification for change outputs or self-spend outputs, or outputs that went to other addresses that you don't know about.
But if I was a merchant and I always reuse the same address or whatever, for whatever reason, then that flow would potentially be compatible.
Yeah, you should be able to mimic the same behavior. It's just that now you have an extra choice, and then that pushes some work on the API. And it sounds like the LWS is going to have a lot more features.
your configuration option is going to be like 700 submenus.
Well, it can't be worse than Monero D. So
you're right; it cannot be worse. But suppose you were at a charity though, or you're a developer, in the donation section on the bottom, you just put a static Monero address, for example. You could give that address to the same server that has your find received key, and then they could give you a push notification for funds sent to that specific address. Correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. So
as long as you're not sending it to yourself to that address.
Okay.
Because we have this special path that hides the ones that you send to yourself.
Okay, that's a good edge case to consider, but I hope that no one would be angry that they didn't get a notification that they sent themselves money. Really hoping that isn't a super critical feature for anybody that is otherwise insurmountable. But it's better to make it hard for people to screw up the privacy on that, I would definitely think. So the different derivation path is definitely the right choice, even if it means breaking that functionality.
We did as much as we possibly could to hide information from the find receive key.
Yeah, and that's
kind of the result here.
at that point, then we would consider like, okay, from Cake side, do we want to offer this where you can give your find receive key up and Cake servers will scan them all for you, and it'll be much better than my Monero now, but it's still not as good as your own, and
Right.
the difference large enough for you to care? Who knows? But at least gets us in the direction of user experience coming at much lower privacy cost. So
Isn't there a simpler solution where you would just notify yourself when you actually do the self-spend? Like sending a BCC and an email. I mean, like sometimes I get the idea that could be easily implemented if that was really desired.
well, the problem is, suppose I had the same private key for Cake Wallet on my phone and the same private key for the GUI on my computer, and I send myself money on the GUI, and then I write an angry letter about why I didn't see a push notification on my phone.
Well,
Right,
you
that's usually what
won't be
happens,
able
Arctic, is
to. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess it's possible. But I mean, I
everything
guess
that can happen will happen in software.
Well,
That's the way it works.
you could probably configure the phone to be notified. Also, I mean,
You
you
could
could.
probably disable the self spend thing if you really got concerned about this.
It sounds to me it's the kind of thing that can be implemented in a more, shall we say, low-tech approach.
But how am I supposed to be notified of my churn status, which is a very specific Monero privacy gung-ho implementation for which I would just gladly hand this special scanning key over to someone else for? These are very much compatible with each other.
I gotta laugh at some of this.
I mean, what if I really care about my Monero privacy to the point where I go to churn, but I don't care enough such that I do share this key with someone else?
Yeah, just watch me churn. Then I guess that'd be funny. Like this, my Monero's watching you churn.
My Monero probably is watching some people churn today. No joke.
Right.
They're probably sending money in between different like my Monero wallets, thinking it's private. Like, oh look, and it's like,
You're right. I hate to say that, but you're right.
So anyway, yes, that's very much an edge case about someone being angry that they don't get a push notification for said self-receive of like a self-churn or whatever. But like, it is what it is. It's better that is not handed over in such a way that the server would be able to tell easily. That was more fun than I thought I'd have on view key scanning. We have a few minutes left. Are there any other topics that people want to talk about at this Monero Meet? There aren't really any other questions that came in. Most of them are related to what LWS is, but I think we pretty much addressed that it's a separate server that can optionally scan with the view key or some view key in the future with Seraphis that would make scanning on your phone no longer necessary, or whatever device you're using, because this could run in the background and even could feed you information such as, if you provided the address, information about when you received transactions, so stuff like that.
Yeah, there's one thing I wouldn't mind mentioning: CoinCard's trends.
Oh, that's a good one. Make sure give the background on that article, mind if someone doesn't know what CoinCards is.
CoinCards is essentially, you can use Monero to buy prepaid value with a host of merchants. This time, if I understand correctly, this is available in the United States. It's available in Canada. And the idea is essentially you're buying gift cards, and depending on which one you pick, you may have to pay a fee, or the merchant pays the fee, and there's a certain ratios. And they have been having a very steady growth in Monero usage in this particular platform. And every month you see the latest one is something like 19% or something. We're sort of just behind Ethereum, and Bitcoin is about 33.5. So this is a really interesting indicator of growth in the retail market outside of DNN markets, which I would consider the first case, actually, DNN markets to be an early indicator of growth in the retail markets. But it's just an interesting topic. But definitely, so there's definitely an indication of retail growth in Monero that may not be easily detectable yet, but that's what it's seeing.
I mean, absolutely. More. It's very clear that retail users, use Monero for payments compared to most other cryptocurrencies. And in this case, it was only Bitcoin and Ethereum that had more transactions. And we kind of every month, if you look at the history, we kind of swap back and forth with Litecoin, where we're 1 month it's give or take, but it's pretty similar. And Litecoin has the better advantages of being on more exchanges, has been around for longer, and is also free effectively to send money around. So it's cool to see Monero being a newcomer comparatively come up, but it just shows people do care about spending privately, even if it's on fewer, exchanges and services. In CoinCard's case, where they accept both, Monero has very competitive use.
But it's a very interesting application because, first of all, we went like Litecoin is a 10.something% of 119, which is quite a diversion from the past history where we were kind of neck and neck with them. But the one interesting application of this, which a lot of people not realize, is that a lot of these cards can be purchased digitally on a phone for an arbitrary amount in a range. So you actually create a situation where somebody goes to, say, Lowe's, and the Lowe's is a great example. They buy, say, 130. You have to calculate how much that is. And while they're sitting in the lineup, they can go there, send Monero to CoinCards, generate a Lowe's card for roughly the amount or a bit above the amount that they're going to pay. And by the time they get to the cash register, they got the card ready, and they just scan it at Lowe's and pay for their merchandise. I mean, this is an example of what I'm talking about. So it's a very interesting hybrid between a use of a prepaid value, basically a gift card, and an actual Monero payment. And the downside to all of this is actually quite expensive to the merchant. But it's very interesting because that's the classic example. If you have a digital card, you can decide the amount and then essentially, whilst you're waiting in line, prepare the Monero transaction. Now, what you have to do, of course, is figure out exactly how much you have in the card and what all the taxes and everything is going to be. So that's not so simple. Or be prepared to top it up with a small amount of cash or something like that if you want to stay private.
Yeah.
But it's basically a one-use card. So that's the interesting element to it. But it's still, I can see the application of this. Particularly in the month of January, which I thought was interesting because that's after the big holiday spending season.
I don't know. Yep, a good point. Yeah, I think we'll be. CoinCards added Monero less than a year ago, somewhere like that, about a year ago, roughly, and it's really exploded to be a substantial part of their business. They're sponsoring Monerotopia, for example, so they very much clearly are already giving back and see the value of supporting Monero. So I think that's really good. We need more people to do stuff like that. So I hope they stand as just one example of a success story of accepting Monero in the space, and I hope others follow. Any other final questions, comments before we wrap this up? Very interesting Monero Meet this month, in my opinion. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Going once. Going twice. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I had a lot of fun. I'm Justin. We had Need Money 90, Arctic Mind Co, and VT Nerd. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you again next month. And keep using your Monero. Use it to buy things. If you must make a cryptocurrency payment, use Monero. Don't use anything else. That's a stupid idea. So, all right. Take care, everyone. I hope you have a great month. See you all later.